There was a real change in the environmental movement. It began to focus much more strongly on the energy sector and much less on saving the whales. And there was a big difference. I mean, the energy sector involved trillions of dollars. The whales, not so much.
Right. In the 1970s, the world was gripped by a very different kind of fear about the future of the planet. The headlines were not about global warming, melting ice caps, or rising sea levels. They were about global cooling. Scientists, journalists, and politicians alike were warning that the Earth's temperature was dropping at a dangerous rate. Prestigious publications like Time Newsweek and the New York Times ran alarming stories predicting that human pollution would block sunlight, the planet would cool dramatically, and the world might soon face another ice age. This wasn't a fringe belief, it was a mainstream narrative supported by data showing a few decades of temperature decline from the 1940s through the early 1970s. Environmental movements at the time adopted this warning as part of a broader push for environmental reform. The first Earth Day in 1970 symbolized this shift toward environmental awareness, but the central fear was that the planet might get too cold for survival, not too hot. It's almost unthinkable today, given how different the public conversation has become, but the same sense of urgency, fear, and moral obligation existed back then, just directed at a different threat. This shift in scientific consensus reveals something deeply important about how public narratives are formed. Science, by its nature, evolves as new evidence emerges. But the problem is not with changing conclusions, it's with how these conclusions are communicated and weaponized by those in power. When the global cooling theory started losing ground in the late 1970s, temperatures began to rise slightly again, and the very institutions that once warned about freezing now began warning about overheating. The fear flipped almost overnight. Instead of prepare for an ice age, the message became prepare for catastrophic warming. The same data was now being interpreted in the opposite direction, and the same emotional tools, fear, guilt, and urgency were used to rally public support. It was no longer about pollution causing less sunlight. Now it was about industrial activity causing too much trapped heat. The problem stayed global, the danger stayed existential, and the solution still required massive government intervention. The sector, unlike wildlife or forests, involves unimaginable sums of money. Fossil fuels, electricity generation, mining, and manufacturing form the backbone of every economy. When activists began targeting the energy industry, they weren't just advocating for environmental reform, they were entering a battlefield worth trillions of dollars. Every regulation, every emission limit, every new green policy represented massive shifts in wealth and control. Replacing fossil fuels with alternative energy sources meant dismantling industries that had powered the world for over a century. It also meant creating entirely new industries, funded by governments and private investors, that would become some of the wealthiest enterprises in history. This transition was no longer about environmental ethics, it was about economic opportunity. Suddenly, saving the planet became a business model. The rise of carbon dioxide as the ultimate villain in the story of climate change is one of the most fascinating transformations in modern environmental science. For decades, CO2 was viewed as a harmless and even essential part of life on Earth. It is, after all, the gas that plants breathe to create oxygen and sustain the planet's ecosystems. Every tree, crop, and blade of grass depends on it. Yet somewhere along the line, CO2 was rebranded from life giver to life destroyer. This shift didn't happen because of a sudden discovery about the gas itself. It happened because the narrative needed a measurable enemy. CO became the perfect target because it could be tracked, taxed, and tied directly to industrial progress. The more society grew, the more CO2 it emitted, and that correlation made it easy to link human development to planetary destruction. But when we look closer at the science, the picture becomes far less dramatic than the one painted by politicians and media headlines. In the 1960s and 1970s, Japanese climatologist Suki Manabe conducted pioneering research on the greenhouse effect. His work was groundbreaking because it quantified how much CO2 could theoretically warm the Earth's atmosphere. His findings showed that doubling CO2 levels might raise the planet's temperature by roughly half a degree Celsius, a small and manageable change.
Science is settled, and the Earth is warming. We have to act now.
You say everyone.
I don't say everyone. A lot of politicians.
Politicians are very attractive to this because it gives them power.
Right, and it's hard to define.
Yeah.
And you can argue, and if you argue against it, you're a bad person.
Well, you do all that, but we spend part of a year in France. My wife is French. Ordinary people, once you get to the countryside, don't take this all that seriously.
Right. Politicians quickly discovered that the phrase, trust the science, was not just a slogan but a powerful political tool. It allowed them to wrap their policies in the authority of science, silencing critics while appearing rational and moral. The problem, however, is that this phrase distorts what science actually is. Science is not a belief system. It is a process built on doubt, testing, and challenge. When politicians say trust the science, they're really saying trust us because it's their interpretation of the data that shapes laws, regulations, and global agendas. Over time, this has turned science from a method of inquiry into a weapon of control. The public has been conditioned to equate skepticism with ignorance and obedience with intelligence, even though true scientific thinking has always depended on questioning assumptions. By promoting blind trust, governments gain the power to act without accountability. During every major climate conference or summit, leaders stand before cameras insisting that science demands immediate action as though a consensus of scientists had handed them a moral directive. But science doesn't make moral or political judgments. It provides data, probabilities, and models. Decisions about how to respond are human and political, yet by hiding behind the authority of science, politicians avoid responsibility for the consequences. This manipulation is why climate debates have become so emotional and polarized. People no longer discuss evidence, they discuss allegiance. If you agree with the official stance, you're seen as enlightened. If you question it, you're a denier. This binary framing has nothing to do with the scientific spirit and everything to do with maintaining power through narrative control. The danger of turning science into dogma is that it destroys the foundation of progress. Great scientists from Galileo to Einstein advanced human knowledge precisely because they refused to trust the science of their time. The idea of achieving net zero carbon emissions has been presented as humanity's noble mission to save the planet, but behind the inspiring speeches and glossy marketing lies a growing humanitarian and economic crisis. Net zero policies, at their core, aim to eliminate or offset all carbon emissions, forcing nations to transition away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy sources. On paper, it sounds like the perfect solution: clean energy, a stable climate, and a sustainable future. But in reality, the transition has been anything but smooth. The rush to implement these policies without realistic alternatives has caused energy costs to skyrocket, industries to collapse, and millions of ordinary people to struggle under the weight of rising prices. What was supposed to protect the planet is, in many cases, punishing its inhabitants, especially those in poorer nations who can least afford it. In the United Kingdom, energy bills have tripled in some areas after the government aggressively pushed renewable mandates and carbon taxes. The promise of cheap, abundant green energy has not materialized. Instead, wind and solar farms often fail to produce enough power during periods of low wind or cloud cover, forcing countries to rely on imported electricity or backup fossil fuel plants just to keep the lights on. This inconsistency means that even as nations spend billions on renewable infrastructure, they must still maintain expensive traditional systems to prevent blackouts. The costs of this dual system are passed directly to consumers. What's more alarming is that developing countries, those still struggling to industrialize, are being told to follow the same path despite lacking the infrastructure or capital to support the transition. In many African and Asian nations, billions of people still live without reliable access to electricity. Coal, oil, and natural gas remain the most affordable and practical options for generating power. But international climate agreements discourage or even ban investment in these resources. Western nations, having built their prosperity on fossil fuels, now pressure developing economies to forego the same path in the name of environmental responsibility. The result is a cruel paradox. The rich world lectures the poor about reducing emissions while continuing to consume vast amounts of energy themselves. For a farmer in Africa or a factory worker in South Asia, net zero doesn't mean environmental justice. It means darkness, unemployment, and economic stagnation. The Earth's temperature has never been constant, and the idea that it should remain in a perfectly balanced state is a modern illusion. Throughout history, the planet has gone through endless cycles of warming and cooling long before humans started burning coal or driving cars. Ice ages came and went, deserts bloomed into forests and then turned back to dust, and oceans rose and fell naturally over thousands of years. Geological records show that even without human influence, the Earth's climate is dynamic and self-adjusting. These fluctuations are driven by powerful natural forces: solar radiation, volcanic activity, ocean currents, and the planet's own orbital changes known as Milankovitch cycles. Yet in recent decades, people have been led to believe that any change in temperature, even a minor one, must be a sign of human failure. This oversimplification ignores the complex, ever-changing system that Earth truly is and reduces it to a political talking point instead of a scientific reality. For most of human history, climate change was accepted as part of the natural order. The medieval warm period, roughly from the 9th to the 14th century, brought warmer temperatures that allowed agriculture to flourish in Europe and Greenland. This was followed by the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures from the 14th to the 19th century, which led to crop failures and harsh winters across the Northern Hemisphere. These shifts happened without factories, cars, or industrial emissions. They were the result of natural cycles that humans could not control. Yet in the modern era, climate change has been reframed as something entirely our doing, an emergency that must be fixed through taxes, regulations, and political pledges. This new mindset ignores the evidence of the planet's long and independent history. The Earth doesn't obey political deadlines or human agendas. It moves to the rhythm of the cosmos, not the rhythm of headlines. The danger in pretending the climate was once stable is that it gives people a false sense of control. Politicians promise to stop climate change as though weather patterns could be legislated. Activists march with slogans demanding to fix the climate, but the reality is that nature cannot be frozen in time. Every attempt to hold it still, to maintain a perfect global temperature, misunderstands how life on Earth works. Climate variability is not the enemy, it's part of the planet's design. Without it, ecosystems would collapse, species would not adapt, and evolution itself would halt. Warm periods and cold periods both play crucial roles in shaping biodiversity and human civilization. The story of humanity is the story of adaptation to these natural rhythms, not the conquest of them.